Rome. The year is 897. Inside the Basilica of St. John Lateran, torches flicker against cold stone walls. Bishops gather, their faces grim, their voices hushed. At the front, seated upon a throne draped in papal robes, is not a living man. It is a corpse, the rotting remains of a dead pope. And today, that corpse will be put on trial. This grotesque event, known as the Cadaver Synod, has become one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Catholic Church. A trial where politics, revenge, and madness collided in front of the world. But to understand why Rome turned against its own dead pope, we must first return to a time of chaos. The 9th century was an age of turmoil. The Roman Empire had long since fallen. The papacy, once a beacon of stability, had become entangled in brutal power struggles. Noble families, kings and emperors fought not only over land, but over who would control the throne of St. Peter. In the center of this storm stood Pope Formosus, a man whose papacy was riddled with controversy, but also with ambition. Born in 816, Formosus was a skilled diplomat, sent across Europe to broker peace and alliances. He won favor with the Franks, angered powerful Roman families, and became both admired and despised. To some, he was a capable leader. To others, a dangerous schemer. Formosus' greatest mistake was his alliance with the Carolingian dynasty, foreign rulers from across the Alps who sought to dominate Italy. When he crowned Emperor Arnulf of Carinthia as the Holy Roman Emperor, he directly challenged the influence of the powerful Spoletan family, one of Rome's most ruthless dynasties. Formosus' death in 896 should have ended his troubles. But in Rome, the dead were not always safe. His enemies were determined to destroy his legacy, even if it meant dragging his corpse back into the light. Months after Formosus' burial, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, faced immense pressure from the Spoletans. Stephen, already unstable and desperate to keep his throne, made a decision that would horrify history. He ordered that Formosus be exhumed from his grave. His corpse, decaying, broken, dressed in rotting papal vestments, was to be placed on trial. And so, in the year 897, Rome gathered for a spectacle unlike any other. Bishops, priests, and nobles crowded into the Lateran Basilica. At the center, on a throne, sat the lifeless body of Pope Formosus. Beside him, a trembling deacon was assigned the impossible role to speak on behalf of the dead pope. What followed would shock the world and forever stain the history of the Church. The trial began in January of 897. The Basilica of St. John Lateran was filled with clergy and nobles, their eyes fixed on a sight so grotesque it seemed almost unreal. Seated upright on the papal throne was the corpse of Pope Formosus. His withered body, decayed from months in the earth, was dressed once more in papal vestments. His crown was set upon a lifeless skull. His fingers, blackened with death, rested on the armrests of his throne. This was no ordinary trial. This was theater, a spectacle of humiliation. At the head of the synod stood Pope Stephen VI. His eyes were wild, his voice sharp, his anger barely concealed. To the gathered bishops, he declared that Formosus had betrayed the Church, that even in death his crimes demanded judgment. But of course a corpse cannot speak, and so a deacon was chosen to answer for him. Shaking with fear, the young cleric stood at Formosus' side. Each question Stephen barked, the deacon stammered out an answer, pretending to be the voice of the dead pope. It was mockery, it was madness. The charges were read aloud, that Formosus had broken canon law by abandoning his bishopric in Porto to seize the papal throne, that he had committed perjury in his dealings with the Frankish kings, that he had conspired for power, serving his own ambition rather than the will of God. The corpse was silent, yet condemned. Witness after witness testified, not to seek truth, but to appease the wrath of Stephen and his Spoleto allies. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The Cadaver Synod was never meant to deliver justice. It was meant to erase the memory of Formosus, to strip him of dignity, to turn his papacy into a warning. And when the sentence came, It was as savage as the trial itself. Formosus was declared guilty, his election to the papacy invalid, his acts as pope null and void. Then, in a ritual of desecration, his corpse was stripped of the papal garments. The 3 fingers of his right hand, those once raised in blessing, were hacked off with a blade. His body was dragged from the throne, tossed aside like refuse. But even that was not enough. Stephen VI ordered the corpse to be buried once more, only to have it dug up again, weighted with stones, and thrown into the river Tiber. The Cadaver Synod was more than a grotesque trial. It was a performance of power, a message that in Rome, politics reigned supreme, even over death itself. The body of Formosus, once a pope, had been reduced to a puppet. And Pope Stephen, in his frenzy, had crossed a line that horrified the city. But if Stephen thought this trial would secure his rule, he was mistaken. The people of Rome had seen enough, and soon the fury he unleashed on a corpse would turn against him. The spectacle of the Cadaver Synod was meant to crush the memory of Pope Formosus. Instead, it ignited outrage. The people of Rome, priests, nobles, and commoners alike, had watched as their city's sacred seat of power descended into madness. They had seen a corpse dragged before an altar. They had witnessed their faith mocked in the name of politics, and they were horrified. For generations, the papacy had been marred by corruption and intrigue, but never had the church sunk so low. Whispers spread through Rome. Stephen VI had gone too far. Some called him a puppet of the Spoleto family. Others called him insane. What united them all was fury. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, riots broke out. The Roman people demanded justice for the desecration of Formosus. They demanded the end of Stephen's papacy. The city, already torn by political factions, turned its anger against the man who had humiliated a pope, even in death. The backlash was swift. Stephen VI was seized, stripped of his power, and thrown into prison. There, the man who had placed a corpse on trial faced his own reckoning. Before the year was out, he was strangled to death in his cell. The Pope who had condemned a body to the river now became another body silenced by Rome's fury. But the story did not end with Stephen's death. Over the next decades, the memory of the Cadaver Synod haunted the Church. Successive popes rushed to undo its damage. They annulled Stephen's decrees. They restored Formosus's reputation. His body, once dragged through the streets and thrown into the Tiber, was recovered and buried again with honor in St. Peter's Basilica. It was an act of redemption, but also an admission. The Cadaver Synod had scarred the papacy. It had revealed just how far men in power would go to secure their rule, even if it meant turning the sacred into a spectacle. And yet the shadow of the Cadaver Synod lingered. It became a warning. For centuries after, the event was whispered in Rome as a symbol of corruption and madness at the heart of the Church, a reminder that even the holiest of institutions could fall prey to the darkest impulses of men. In the year 897, the Church tried a dead pope, but in truth, it was the living who were on trial, and history has delivered its verdict. Centuries have passed since that winter day in 897, when a corpse sat upon a throne in the Lateran Basilica. Yet the Cadaver Synod remains one of the most haunting chapters in the history of the papacy. It was not just a trial of a dead man, it was the trial of the Church itself. The legacy of the Synod lies not only in its grotesque spectacle, but in what it revealed. The papacy, in the late 9th century, was not the stable, holy institution we imagine today. It was fragile, torn between warring noble families, foreign kings, and the ambitions of desperate men. The throne of St. Peter was not merely spiritual, it was political. And where politics ruled, corruption followed. Formosus had become a pawn in these struggles, and even in death, his body was used to make a statement. The Cadaver Synod showed the world that in Rome, power mattered more than dignity, more than faith, more than the sacred. Later popes tried to bury the memory of the Synod. They restored Formosus' name, they reversed Stephen's verdicts, they honored him once more as a true pope. But the damage had already been done. The event became a stain, a symbol of just how fragile the Church could be when entangled in worldly ambition. And yet, in a strange way, the Cadaver Synod has endured precisely because of its grotesque nature. Historians still tell the story. Believers and skeptics alike recoil in horror. And each time the tale is retold, it reminds us of a simple, unsettling truth: that power, once corrupted, can strip away even the most sacred of traditions. The Cadaver Synod was not just an act of madness. It was a mirror reflecting the violence, corruption, and desperation of an age when popes were as vulnerable as kings, and faith was entangled with politics. It was a warning that history has never forgotten. In Rome, a pope once tried another pope, but in the end, it was not Formosus who stood condemned. It was the Church itself.